And the first question might be, well, why would it be on a mountain? And talking about that allows us to understand to some degree, right initially, how complicated these things are. Words and phrases and poetic titles make sense to us because they appeal to us at emotional, motivational, and embodied level. And so you think, well, do you become enlightened in a valley, in a pit, or on a mountain? And the answer is, well, you become enlightened on a mountain, not in a valley. And why would that be? Well, you can't see in a valley, right? You're hemmed in. And so your vision is blocked by the surroundings. And it's dark in a valley compared to on a mountain, especially on a mountaintop, and you're closer to heaven on a mountaintop as well, in the symbolic sense, although you're also, in some sense, in the sky. And the sky is up, and up is the place you aim, and up is where the heavenly bodies are, the sun and the moon and the stars, and we orient ourselves by the heavenly bodies, right? Because human beings are navigators, and we've learned to use the sky to literally to orient ourselves when we move from one place to another. And so part of the reason that a sermon that's enlightening is delivered on a mountain is because that makes sense to creatures like us. And there's these old comic tropes of people climbing a mountain to see a guru who's perched on top, often in a lotus position, delivering wisdom. And that's also associated with the old Egyptian idea and the Mesopotamian idea of the eye of attention. And so you see in Egypt, there was a god, Horus, who was symbolized by the eye and also by the falcon. Falcons, by the way, are birds of prey, like eagles, raptors in general, and they're the only animals that have better vision than us. And so they've been used for a long time as a symbol of the capacity to see long distances from above and extraordinarily clearly. And the falcon, of course, can fly above everything as well as having great vision. And if you remember The Lion King, the movie The Lion King, there was a little bird in there named Zazu, and Zazu was the eye of the king because he could fly above everything else and see. And that's an extremely interesting issue too, because, and in the Mesopotamian creation myth, the god Marduk, who was their monotheistic god and a precursor of Christ in some sense in that manner, he had eyes all the way around his head and he could speak magic words. So there's an idea there in Mesopotamia of the doctrine of the word and the magic word that can bring things into reality, which is what we do with our words for better or worse, and what we actually and truly do with them. Because what you say changes your destiny and it changes the destiny of people around you. And that's really worth thinking about, because you just have no idea how deep that truth goes and how much role you play in shaping the way the future transforms itself into the present and the past as a consequence of what you say. It's a core element of Christian doctrine that the word is the fundamental creative process that brings order into being out of chaos and potential. And you participate in that. That's partly why in Genesis, in the first chapter, God uses the word that is true and oriented by love to bring about the habitable order that is good, and then makes the rather radical proposition that men and women are made in that image. And so you can think about that in your own life. So the idea of love is that despite its suffering and malevolence, the world is worth supporting and working to improve. And that's a real tough commitment, right? Because to the degree that your life is tragic and that it's contaminated by your malevolence and the malevolence of other people, it can make you bitter and resentful and destructive, and it can interfere with your desire to improve what's torturing and tormenting you, which also might be you. And so part of the reason there's an emphasis in many religious traditions and certainly in Christianity on faith is because the evidence about the goodness of being is in some sense ambivalent, right? I mean, you can tell that not least because of the culture war that's tearing us apart right now, because the accusers, so to speak, say that the world's so corrupt, human beings are so corrupt, that we're best understood as nothing but the drive to malevolent power in some sense. And it's a pretty powerful critique, because it's not like history isn't a complete catastrophe in many ways, and it's not as if we lack the capacity to make other people's lives miserable and our own, and also, I suppose, to some degree, pose a threat if we're not careful to the ecological integrity of the planet. And so there's reasons to be unhappy about the conditions of existence. And part of the faith that is imposed on you, let's say within the confines of the religious doctrines of Judaism and Christianity, not to say it isn't the case in other religious traditions, is that you should move forward as if you're benevolently predisposed to existence itself, to being itself, and that would be life, your life, other people's lives, life in general, but being as such, despite the fact that you're cursed with the burden of your mortal vulnerability. And that's no joke, right? That's as heavy a burden, a moral burden that can possibly be placed on people. And you have to accept it as a presupposition of faith, because, as I said, at best, the evidence is ambivalent. You know, women will think, I shouldn't bring a child into a world such as this. And historians will look at events like Auschwitz and the Gulag archipelagos and all the catastrophes of the 20th century and say, well, if history is such a bloody nightmare, is it really something that we should propagate forward in time? These are very profound questions. In Goethe's great play, Faust, there's a demonic character, the devil himself, Mephistopheles, and Mephistopheles is the great adversary of being. And his credo is that life is so rife with suffering and malevolence that it would be better if consciousness didn't exist at all. So we're called upon, I would say, ethically and practically and philosophically and spiritually to lift our eyes up to the heavens or to the hills. And there's another reason for that too, which is that our primary problem in orienting ourselves in life is actually a navigation problem. It's not a perceptual or a conceptual problem. It's how you get from point A to point B, because we're mobile creatures and we're always concerned with what we're going to do next and what we encounter along the way. And that means that we have to be aiming at something to move forward, because why move forward if you're not aiming at something? And why would you move forward towards something you're aiming at if you weren't aiming up? Because the place you're going to, if it's not better than the place you're at, why would you work to move there? And so that idea of up is built into our conception, not only of progress forward, but it's also built into us psychophysiologically and neuropharmacologically, because most of the positive emotion you experience now, and this is worth knowing, man, is experienced in relationship to a goal. And so you might think you're happy because you attain things, but that's actually not why you're happy. You might be satisfied if you attain something, but it's fleeting because you attain it, and then the question is, well, now what, right? So when you graduate from high school, well, you've attained that graduation status, but the next day you wake up and you're no longer king of the high school, you're entry-level junior clerk at the local drugstore. Not that that's such a catastrophe, but you get my point. Being at the pinnacle isn't exactly the goal. Now, what happens if you want to experience the positive emotion that can help sustain you through life and can also, what would you say? Well, fill you with enthusiasm, which means to be filled with God. By the way, entheos is to be filled with the Spirit of God, is you have to be aiming at something worth aiming at. And this is literally the case. The more vital the thing is that you're aiming for, the more positive emotion you experience when you notice that you're moving towards a goal. And so one of the things this means is that if you don't have an aim, and even an ethical aim, because you're aiming up, right? You're aiming at something better. If you don't have an aim and an ethical aim, you literally cannot experience any positive emotion. And more than that, the higher your aim, now that assumes that you're not making things impossibly difficult for yourself, but the higher your aim, the higher the more intense the positive emotion associated with evidence of progress. And so then what you might derive from that, if you were thinking about setting your life up properly, is that you should aim at the highest possible thing. And of course, then that begs the question, what is the highest possible thing? And that's partly what the Sermon on the Mount is.